So, respected guests, esteemed faculty, dear students, and beloved members of Voices from the Periphery. There are rare moments in the life of a community when we find ourselves in the presence of a thinker whose work has not only reshaped disciplines but has also redrawn the very horizons of how we imagine the world. Today is one such moment. With awe, gratitude, and the deepest humility, we welcome Professor Arjun Appadurai, a scholar whose name has become synonymous with the sum of the most path-breaking ideas in global social science and whose intellectual vision has touched lives far beyond the academy. Professor Appadurai, currently the Goddard Professor of Media, Culture and Communication at New York University, has over the decades changed the way we think about modernity, globalization, and cultural flows. His writings from modernity at large to fear of small numbers, and from his reflections on global ethnoscapes to his meditations on violence, inequality, and imagination, have set the terms of debate across anthropology, sociology, political theory, and cultural studies. Few scholars command such breadth, and favor still speak with such lucidity, courage, and enduring relevance. For those of us seeking to understand the forces that shape our present, the circulations of people, media, money, and ideas, Professor Appaidurai's works are indispensable. But his brilliance lies not only in the scope of his scholarship, it lies in his unwavering ability to reveal the intimate, the everyday, and the affective within the vast machinery of globalization. He has shown us that imagination itself is a social fact, that the global is always entangled with the local, and that knowledge to be truthful must remain attuned to those pushed to the margins of history. Today, we are profoundly honored to listen to him on the theme The Hegemonic Sensorium and the Persistent of Caste. In this lecture, Professor Appadurai turns his incomparable gaze to one of the most enduring and troubling structures of Indian society, caste, and asks how its persistence is mediated, reproduced, and challenged through our senses, perceptions, and cultural imaginaries. It is a theme that speaks directly to our time when questions of hierarchy, exclusion, and justice remain as urgent as ever, and when we must learn to see, hear, and feel the operations of power in ways that unsettle the comfortable certainties of knowledge. On behalf of Voices from the Periphery, we offer our deepest gratitude to Professor Appadurai for being with us today. For us, his presence is not simply that of a distinguished scholar. It is the presence of a visionary, a guide, and an intellectual force who reminds us that scholarship can transform the world when it is rooted in courage, imagination, and responsibility. With reverence, admiration, and unbounded respect, we welcome you, Professor Appadurai. Up to you, sir.
Thank you very much, Pallab, to you and your colleagues from this very interesting and courageous group that you have. So I'm very pleased to be here. I have only one small technical question that other than you and Professor Patnaik, everybody else has their video is not their only their name. Is that a deliberate? If they want to all be behind some wall, it's okay. But if I can see the faces, since they can see my face, that is also better. But they may prefer just to be represented by initials and some other symbols. I will leave it to them. I'll just say to you all, if you are there, uh, feel free to activate your cameras, but there is no pressure. If you prefer to see without being seen, that is also okay. It's relevant to today's topic, actually. So, thank you again for this opportunity, and I will speak, as I think we agreed, for no more than 45 minutes, beyond which anybody, normal human beings' attention is bound to stray. So I will try and stick to that And I have a watch here also to keep me on track on that. And then we can have some Q&A for whatever amount of time you wish. So I go into my talk now. My fundamental question is, why has caste in India endured for almost 2 millennia, although it is plainly extractive, humiliating, and disenfranchising for the vast majority of the population throughout this time? This is a fundamental question since it seeks to explain the resilience of certain systems of inequality by focusing on persistence, endurance, and durability as systemic features which have to be actively produced and reproduced and not be viewed as default or natural conditions. I plan to treat resilience as an issue which needs to be explained in its own right and not as the simple obverse of change. So, in this perspective, if you look at persistence of these systems over a long period of time, caste could cast light on race, patriarchy, durable political dictatorships, and other stubborn systems of inequality. In other words, caste can also cast light on other things if looked at in this way. In a recent, so now I talk briefly about hygiene, purity, and social cleansing. In a recent twist in Indian public life, purity, cleanliness, hygiene, and sanitation have become renewed objects of intense partisan debate involving Hindutva scholars writing about ancient India and a new generation of scholars writing on Dalit issues with an eye to examining the sensory order. The invocation of hygiene, the site which makes cleanliness a matter of public concern, converges with epidemiology, town planning, and sanitary engineering. Prime Minister Modi's campaign to modernize the idea of cleanliness, known sometimes as Swachha Bharat Abhiyan, has been subjected to many criticisms and deconstructions. Among these is a brilliant 2019 essay by a colleague called Subro Saha, which builds on the work of Javare, Sarukai, Gopal Guru, and many others about the deep and persistent logics that link bodies, touch, and untouchability in Indic thought and practice. Subro Saha, brings this discussion into alignment with the logic of colonial rule, which succeeded in disciplining and disempowering the manual scavenging castes of India and perpetuating their humiliation because of their bodily immersion into the waste matter of the superior caste. This story is linked to the colonial effort to bring emerging European ideas of hygiene and sanitation into colonial India and reveals the ways in which what Saha calls the idea matter complex attaches itself to new circumstances, ideologies, and strategies without it disturbing its underlying social ontology. Modi's BJP has used the propaganda of the Swachha Bharat Abhiyan to align itself with the public value of cleanliness, but has done so without disturbing the underlying order of touch, purity, and humiliation, which shapes the relationship of manual scavenging to the larger caste order. Modi's push towards public cleanliness appeals to the upper castes without disturbing the ongoing humiliation of Dalits. To understand this logic, it is important to note that bodily pollution, the permanent condition of manual scavengers, extends itself to all Dalits due to the logic of endogamy, food sharing, and physical isolation on ghettos, both urban and in ghettos, both urban and rural. This is a well known characteristic of the logic of the conversion of Varna to Jati by linking the defining and defiling characteristic characteristic of some Dalits to the permanent humiliation of all Dalits. Similarly, the relative ritual superiority of some Savarna individuals is also extended to all their Jati members, regardless of what they actually do in worldly occupational terms. This extension is a particularly invidious feature of the part whole logic, which Louis Dumont regarded as the key marker of hierarchy. But it is not well understood, in my opinion, yet. There is another important historical reality to bear in mind when we look at the long durée of caste. It is widely agreed by scholars of Hindu legal, philosophical, and ritual texts, especially scholars of the Dharma Shastras, that the whole category of untouchables, today called Dalits, is virtually absent from these texts, which are incredibly detailed about the duties, characteristics, rights, and obligations of the four major Varnas. The question of how the four Varnas became the thousands of Jatis which today characterize India has not yet fully been answered, either by anthropologists or by historians or historical demographers. One of my teachers, the late Stanley Thambaya, wrote a brilliant essay in 1973 called From Varna to Caste Through Mixed Unions, meaning mixed marriages. But even Thambaya does not remark on the social invisibility of the many castes, such as Chandalas, who fell outside the boundaries of the social order and gradually came to be collectively identified as unclean and untouchable. And as we know today from the census, that population is safely 15 to 20%. It's not a small number. So to have that completely be absent is a stunning fact from the 98% of the literature of the long centuries. It is my considered opinion that the key to the links between purity, touchability, and humiliation, especially so far as Dalits are concerned, lies in the remarkable extension of the internal logic of touch as applied to the four Varnas to the entire world of Jatis and especially to the Dalit castes who were previously simply outside the legal, ritual, and moral order of caste society. And the logic of this extension cannot be grasped without a rethinking of some of the basics of the history and logic of caste. So, in this light, let me say it is generally acknowledged that the caste system has been the foundation of society in the South Asian subcontinent for around 2 millennia and can securely be traced to around 500 BC when the Varna ideology of the Vedic texts gave way to the idea of Jati based on occupation, endogamy, and division of labor between higher and lower ranked groups. Many people have written on this. What we today call the system of castes, i.e., Jati or a similar term in most Indic languages, is a system whose main characteristics include a ranked hierarchy of major functions, priests, warriors, merchants, peasants, strict rules against marriage outside one's caste, and I will return to that in the conclusion to my lecture. Strict rules, which are called by anthropologists rules about endogamy, that is, marriage outside one's caste is not allowed. And then residential and occupational segregation. All these are held together by a cosmology of sacrifice, purity, and ritual codependence, and a massive underclass of impure castes at the bottom of the system, which we now might call Dalits, but have been called Achut, Chandala, etc., for centuries. In spite of a long history of social and geographical mobility among castes, in spite of the massive effects of Islam, colonialism, capitalism, and human rights legislation on the subcontinent, and despite 75 years having passed since caste was officially abolished in the Indian constitution as a justification for exclusion, exploitation, or humiliation, the caste system is alive and well and dominates marriage, elections, jobs, and migration in India today. This is what I mean by the resilient hegemony. Why does it last so long? For which I seek some sort of new explanation. I address this resilient hegemony through the lens of what Pierre Bourdieu called the habitus, the daily life world, as a key factor in maintaining the caste system. This lens shifts the scale from the macro scale by asking how and why caste works in daily life, in ordinary social reproduction, in the contingencies of deference, humiliation, and obedience. Here we move from invoking grander cosmological inducements, such as the theory of karma, or the textual prescriptions of caste duties, dharma, or the tautologous idea that it is due to power differentials, coercion, and hegemony, which is often said. My question is, where does that come from? So it's not enough to say it's because of hegemony, you have to explain the hegemony. Instead, we need to ask why inferiors in the traffic of daily life so regularly pay homage to their superiors, accept the daily humiliations with which status is reinforced, and consent to a caste-based presentation of themselves in everyday life. Please note, as a footnote, I of course don't mean those who have broken out of it, those who have radicalized, those who have moved in different directions, but I think we all know that's a tiny number compared to the bulk of the oppressed population. This compliance with the face-to-face tyranny of caste can be approached from the great tradition of work exemplified by the American sociologist Irving Goffman, which shows how human beings are pushed into conformity, even in those situations where they are apparently free to do as they please. What, in other words, is the tyranny of etiquette, which penetrates into the most intimate spaces of touch, taste, and sight, thus keeping the rules of caste alive in daily life in the face of numerous laws, social movements, and moral criticisms of it, which are frequent in Indian history. You only have to mention Buddhism, Jainism, Bhakti, Islam, Protestant Christianity, etc., even before the 20th century, to say it is not that there has not been criticism, but compliance continues. My aim in using this everyday lens is also to bring in the complex reasons and justifications which might explain how lower castes, Dalits, but also others, lower OBCs, etc., might themselves contribute to the resilience of caste. The central phenomenological factor here is that while caste, for all of these people, entails being humiliated, dominated, and excluded, for most castes except Brahmins, and even there you might say there are Brahmins of lower rank who are subject to that by the higher Brahmins, but leave that aside for a moment. Caste is also, please take note of this, the surest route to some measure of dignity, security, support, and even livelihood for many lower caste individuals. Thus, since inclusion in one's own caste is the key to surviving exclusion by other castes, The renunciation or rejection of caste as a daily reality can also mean the loss of one's family, one's marriage opportunities, one's jobs and political support, even if these goods are hemmed in by hierarchy and exclusion in the larger system. In short, unless caste can be overthrown completely at all levels and in all contexts, it is extremely risky to refuse compliance with its rules and norms in ordinary life. Thus, we may say that the most stubborn feature of the caste system is not its larger cosmological design, nor its middle level capacity to absorb and co opt critics, reformers, and political opponents, but its tenacious hold on the daily routines of deference, humiliation, avoidance, and disgust in Indian local worlds. This is best seen, and I will try to do this, through the related grammar of touch, contact, and disgust as biosocial codes for hierarchical discrimination in practice. The major question about the tyranny of the face to face is why do so many inferiors in the Indian caste system, and almost everybody is inferior, however angry, resentful, and antagonistic they might feel to their caste superiors, they almost universally agree to comply with the rules of deference, subordination, humiliation in daily life. Rather than take up the entire system of rules, taboos, and sanctions that surround bodily purity and proximity in the caste system, I will focus on one today: the habits and rules that surround touch and touching, which define so much everyday deference in India. And there is a considerable body of scholarship here, but I'm not today going to take up time in giving full citations, etc. But I'm not the first to note this. I'm just adding some small tweaks here and there. The paradox here is that the truly untouchable in this cosmology are the Brahmins, who strive for the status of superior untouchables by making Dalits a sort of displaced and inferior version of their own untouchability. In the hierarchy of contact, Dalits are lowest. In the hierarchy of contact, Dalits are the lowest, but in the hierarchy of untouchability, Brahmins are the lowest. They are supremely untouchable subjects, while the impure caste can be mostly touched by anyone, anytime, for any purposes. And the lower you are, the more you can be touched with impunity. In short, Brahmins determine the conditions of their touchability, while the unclean castes only endure theirs. They put up with whatever the governing rule is. This angle is, for me, a radical move in the study of touchability in the study of caste, because it also suggests that the skin, the epidermis, is not everywhere the same thing, and that the space between skins is not a universal material fact either. In this, I would call it new view of caste, sociability and touch, the haptic, HAPTIC, haptic dangers of social life put Brahmins at the permanent risk of social catastrophe, since touching can never be entirely avoided in a world of human exploitation. You can't exploit without touching. This angle on what Louis Dumont famously in 1970 called Homo hierarchicus allows us to see that in Indic social ontology, the body is already conceived as a haptic technology, as a set of interacting surfaces, screens, interfaces, codes, and algorithms, to use the language of the digital era, to maximizing social value for its most privileged operators, in this case, Brahmins, and to some extent other upper castes, while treating those lower and lowest in the rank system as touchers who do not control the means of touchability, if I may, Paraphrase Marx. Put another way, in the Indic world, and this is a very large generalization for over time and over space, the body has long been primarily a haptic technology for the circulation of social messages and for the reproduction of an asymmetric information order, i.e., who is up, who is down, who is high, who is low, who is pure, who is impure. That's the information constantly being conveyed. Indeed, the growing consensus among scholars who seek to think in new and radical ways about the links between caste humiliation, bodily violence, and the moral paranoia about touch and touching that animates the highest castes, especially Brahmins, is that the exclusion of untouchables, which is a very old story in India, radical exclusion, is a social proxy for the deeper disgust of Brahmins and other high savarnas about the sensorium. That is the word in my title, sensorium. This disgust about the sensorium, which the upper castes also experience in and through their senses, not Brahmins alone, is certainly about the wrong kinds of look, touch, sound, or smell that the senses can bring to them, thus unsettling their haptic equipoise, balance. It is in fact deeper and more difficult to resolve. It is in fact why do I say deeper? Because our normal habit, certainly mine and most of the social scientists I know, is to see the disgust as directed to others, especially Dalits, but also other lower people. But what I am saying, it is really a disgust about the irreducibility of the body to being a mere shell for the eternal, the non-corporeal, and the transcendent. From this, you see, upper caste, Brahmin, Savarna point of view, what I'm saying, the body is always dragged back into its own urine, its feces, its semen, its sweat, hair, nails, and menstrual blood, all of which are built to exit the body only to grow and return forever. There is no permanent exit for those things, as we know. The untouchable in his role of scavenger, here I've coined a phrase, is the slave who saves. In other words, he's constantly removing all those things from your life so you can remain clean for a moment. For he ceaselessly tries to carry away this abhorrent filth, becoming him or herself a sort of moral infrastructure, more important than all castes or any caste, but actually the key to their constant effort to resist the haptic intimacy of their own bodily livings. This is the key. When I think back to my whole life experience with my own family and with other people of the upper caste, effort is to resist the haptic intimacy of their own bodily livings. Those of you who observed Orthodox Brahmin men and women handling food, you'll notice breaking a piece of banana and popping it into your mouth. Well, what are you scared about? You're scared about your own saliva. So this is a kind of auto pollution which is being managed 24/7 all the time by these most high. That is why I call them the highest untouchables, because they're even worried about their own internal touch. My saliva is touching this, my urine is touching that. For myself, leave aside everybody else. So this is where Hegel's ideas, master and slave, are helpful insofar as they remind us of the powers of the slave, however humiliated and degraded he or she might be. Thus, the enemy of the Brahmin project is the sensorium, the faculties of smelling, touching, tasting, seeing, and hearing, and not those substances such as sweat, excrement, saliva, and menstrual blood, which are the most aggressive users of these portals, these windows, into the pure habitations of Brahmin thought. And by extension, you might say upper Savarna. Same logic is taken on. The Dalit is a social personification of the sensorium, and thus he offends the Brahmanic order by incarnating the materiality of all sociality, including Brahmin sociality. Since Brahmins themselves are trying to escape the bonds of both sociality and materiality, they are entrapped by their own construction of Dalits as solely and exclusively bodies of matter, which should not matter to Brahmin bodies. See, but that is not possible. But politics, law, and exposure to such religions as Christianity and Islam have made it impossible for Brahmins to argue that Dalit bodies do not matter, either as persons or as matter. But they do have the awesome power to impede thought, according to Brahmins, to which, as matter, they are fundamentally opposed. In other words, the idea is that Dalits are virtually purely matter, and Brahmins are ideally purely thought. Not true in reality, but that's the aspirational logic. This power, from the Brahmin point of view, explains the constant effort to distance, demonize, humiliate, and exorcise Dalits from the social world. This Dalit power is the social object of the Brahmin terror of the senses. And this is what creates the entirety of Brahmin orthopraxy, orthodox practice, which takes the phenomenological form of the obsession with purity. See, so I'm coming around to giving you a slightly different idea about this purity, which is the old thing, everybody has observed it, but I'm coming at it from a slightly different, stealthy route. The radical disrecognition of Dalits by Brahmins is due to their being seen as enemies of thinking itself, regarded as a Brahmin monopoly. And any effort by Dalits to think is thus not to be encouraged. The Brahmin terror of the senses is about the ubiquitous fear of being unable to think. That is, that they themselves will get cloudy and dark. And all the Brahmin practices of purification, including and especially self-purification, are calculated to free the space of thinking from the sensorium without looking, listening, smelling, tasting, or touching. You can see the impossibility of that, of course. The constant effort to discipline and censor the Dalit body expresses this interminable war of Brahmins with the sensorium. Now, here is a place, though I'm not citing other scholars all the time, I have to make an exception because my insight into this fear of Dalits as minds, that they are matter and they impede our minds, but they have no minds, they should not think, is beautifully brought out by a colleague, in fact, in Hyderabad, called Professor Thirumal, who has written 3, 4, 5, 6 articles from which I've learned immensely and which I must acknowledge here, saying he has also looked at the IITs, how Brahmins react to the presence of Dalit students, contemporary circumstances, saying there is a constant feeling that the Dalit body and its presence on IIT campuses, etc., is adding a kind of dark, tamasic quality which is compromising Brahminic or Savarna thought. So this is not something I'm inventing. Please go and read the works of Professor Thirumal, who is, say, in Hyderabad, and whom probably Professor Patnaik knows. It's remarkable work, and I have learned a lot from it. So you can see that what I'm up to here. This view of the sensorium as both a gateway and a proxy for sociality itself gives us a new angle on the constant need of Brahmins to humiliate, violate, and distance Dalits. The power of Dalits is their ability to exist at that social edge on which sociality meets its opposite, where matter is completely divorced from thought and thus can be totally implicated with dirt, waste, filth, and pollution. So they are that edge point. But where this matter, you see, you might call it, let's say, the Dalit matter, also becomes free from all sociality through its radical distance from the Savarna social order. So you see, in a way, what I'm implying is that Dalits, in this very excluded, humiliated manner, are still very close to the goal of escaping social ties altogether. That is, in fact, what Brahmins want. That's the paradox, you see. This is the limiting point at which untouchability and renunciation, which is a whole other tradition in India, become almost identical. I say almost because the Dalit body is never allowed to escape into asceticism and remains, through the brute power of the Brahmanic order, enmeshed in sociality and its most demeaning demands. Still, the Dalit remains a source of envy and a secret admiration for the Brahmin due to his proximity to the total renunciation of the social. And in fact, people like R.S. Khare and many others have pointed out a deep affinity, ideologically remarked and mobilized, especially in parts of North India and elsewhere, between Dalits and sadhus or ascetics renouncers, because they are the anti-Brahmins, so to speak, from day one. So the search for Dalit dignity has also said, we are those people. So hence Valmikis, they are going not to the Brahmin tradition, saying we have another tradition, equally old, equally distinguished, of renouncers. Now that's another story, we can discuss it. But we have evidence of that connection consciously being made by untouchables themselves. So I come towards my last few pages now. I offer a suggestion that will probably infuriate many of my colleagues who work on Indic cosmology. I suggest that we have mistaken the Brahmin terror of the senses for Brahmin disgust for the body. They are not exactly the same. This is not to deny that the caste order is built on millions of do's and don'ts about how to pass bodily impurity on through some form of social infrastructure and hold on to every ounce of bodily purity acquired either by the luck of birth or through the play of contingency. Hence, we can restate the question of the place of touch and touchability from the starting point of the Brahmin terror of the senses. And I've already mentioned Thurman and his work on this aspect of Brahmin domination. With special reference, he's worked on the media, various other things, but also on higher education, modern higher education, as with the IITs. In this case, I think probably in Chennai, maybe also in Hyderabad, as the places where the gross body of the Brahmin, that is, the Brahmin himself has a gross body and a subtle body, but that gross body is projected onto the Dalit students or others who are present in the environment. The enemy of the Brahmin project, as I've said, is the sensorium. The faculties of smelling, touching, tasting, seeing, and hearing, and not those substances, sweat, excrement, saliva, and menstrual blood, which are the most aggressive users of these portals. And the Dalit is a social personification of the sensorium, and thus he offends the Brahmanic order by incarnating the materiality of all sociality. In other words, if you want to be social, there has to be materiality. And if you have materiality, you will get these problematic contacts. No way to get out of it. So Dalit is constantly reminding Brahmins there is no way to get out of it. Now, since Brahmins are themselves trying to escape the bonds of both sociality and materiality, they are entrapped by their own construction of Dalits as solely and exclusively bodies of matter, which should not matter to Brahmin bodies. But politics, law, and exposure to such religions, as I say, as Christianity, Islam, have made that a difficult position to hold. So we have here then that one last observation, this Brahmin effort to escape and repress the sensorium could appear to be a small variation on the Puritan denial, which is there throughout Western history, of the body with its biblical roots and Cartesian philosophical support. But in my view, it is an entirely different phenomenon. In this Indic ontology, the sensorium is not the root to bodily pleasures, desires, and seductions, but is rather the primary gateway to sociality, which is the primary object of Brahmin terror. Brahmins don't want to relate to anybody else, to put it more simply. The foundational wish of Brahmins is to escape all sociality. Hence, Brahmins have always feared and admired ascetics, as I have said, world renouncers, sadhus of every type, including fakes. And this begins to offer us a deeper insight into the issue of touch and touchability. And I refer here to a now quite old work of Ravindra Khare on the Chamars of Lucknow, where he documents very carefully in the 1920s how organic intellectuals from the Dalit classes in Lucknow consciously said, we come from the ascetic tradition. So we are not a new low body, we are a high body which is counterposed to Brahmins. I refer you to Ravindra Khare's classic work on this subject. So what I want to say is two things, and then I more or less will stop. One is that this sense that Dalits are both dangerously close to all of those material faculties and forces which Brahmins are trying to distance themselves from. In the process, Dalits are also almost free because they are told they are no good to anything. That means you're out. So what is the difference then between Dalits and sadhus? Well, obviously there's a difference in terms of how they're treated in ordinary life, but there is an inner affinity. And for Brahmins, both are sources of deep negativity. In the case of sadhus, you might say it's ambivalence because they are kind of above Brahmins in leaving it all behind. Dalits are doing it from below, but there is some affinity there. Now, if something in what I have said, which has to do with touch, with purity, and with the sensorium, that is the real source of the paranoia of Brahmins, which then produces the constant effort to self-purify and to keep what they regard as the purifiers at a distance. So you want purity, but not the purifiers. It's a remarkably difficult position to sustain. But in order to explore the second major part of the question, which is then, why do the people, not only Dalits, but all lower castes, OBCs and others, for example, in Tamil Nadu, the whole category of Shudras, of whom many are low, many are very high and in power, but many are low. Why do they, in daily life, forget politics, law, etc., more or less show deference when it is called for to people above them and especially to Brahmins? That is not something I have yet fully answered, though I think there is a path to it. And I'll give the direction by way of conclusion to saying what is required, which I have not tried to do today in this lecture, is to go back to the question of endogamy and marriage. Many of you will know that the great Babasaheb Ambedkar, though he didn't have time to pursue this kind of academic issue fully, pointed out that without endogamy, there is no caste. Finish endogamy and caste is gone. It's not a matter of occupation, food, this, that. You take away the marriage question. So there is a very big question then. So the question becomes translated. Why is endogamy not given up? People may expand the circle of endogamy, but the principle, if you look at the numbers of intercaste marriages, interjati marriages, it is small. In spite of incentives, various states are giving money. If you have a documented interjati marriage, you can get some cash. Even so, the numbers are low. So I think marriage and endogamy needs a fresh examination in relation to purity and pollution and so on. And I will here mention my colleague, Professor Amrit Srinivasan, who has for a long time been working on impurity, on Devadasis, but also on Nayars and marriage as a principle of mobility, but also as a principle of conservatism in the overall life of the Indian caste system. So I would say there is a whole body of work that these ideas about purity and pollution can be connected to, so that we can unpack why, almost uniquely in the world, we have a social order of 1.4 billion people. And I'm not counting Pakistan, Bangladesh, Sri Lanka, etc., where there are massive castes, just India, who, to a remarkable extent, 80 to 19%, 90%, are still marrying within the boundary of endogamy. That is a remarkable fact about the hegemony, the continuation of the system, even when other things are perhaps loosening up or becoming more fluid. So I stop there. I thank you for your attention, and I welcome your comments, questions, whatever you may wish to bring up. I want to be sure I can hear anybody who speaks. And will Professor Patnaik or someone else moderate? Because I don't know who wants to ask questions, whether they will raise their hands or whether they will just speak. I'm not sure. But I welcome all comments and questions. But somebody else other than me has to decide who will speak and when and that. By looking at the chat, perhaps, or something else, or people can raise their hands. There's that icon where you can raise your hand. But someone, one of you, Pallab or Professor Patnaik, must steer the traffic, because I'm not fully sure who is where, etc.
So, thank you, Professor Appadurai, for that truly profound lecture. Your words have not only offered us an analysis but have opened a new way of sensing the world we inhabit. In unraveling how the hegemonic sensorium sustains the persistence of caste, you have revealed that power does not reside only in institutions or texts, but in the very fabric of perception itself. What we are permitted to see, what we are conditioned to hear, and what we are taught to ignore. We have shown us that caste is not merely a social structure, but an embodied experience inscribed in our senses, our habits, and our everyday encounters. Yet at the same time, you have illuminated how these very registers can become grounds for resistance, for reimagining the possible, and for unsettling the hierarchies that claim permission. For all of us gathered here, your lecture has been less a conclusion than an invitation, a call to think with greater honesty and courage about how knowledge, perception, and power are intertwined, and how we might begin to reconfigure them in the pursuit of justice. With these reflections in mind, let us now open the space for questions and dialogue so that we may continue this conversation with you, Professor Appadurai, and deepen the engagement your words have so powerfully sparked. Okay, so with your kind permission, can I ask the questions that are from our YouTube?
Of
Yeah,
course.
thank you so much. Okay, the first question is from Ayush, my friend Ayush. He is the secretary
Uh,
of this
First name,
organization.
please. First name.
The first question is from Ayush, sir. Ayush Dev. He is
Ayush.
the Ayush, yes, sir. He is the secretary of our organization.
Okay.
Okay, and the founder also. So he is asking that if, as you argue, the hegemonic sensorium structures the persistent of caste, how do we avoid reproducing epistemic violence when we attempt to theorize caste through Western derived categories of perception and phenomenology? Can the very act of naming the sensorium be complicit in reinscribing its dominance?
Wonderful. Should I respond, Palab?
Yeah, yeah, sure, sir.
Yes. Yes, thank you. Because it's hard for me to remember several questions at once. So I'll quickly, without taking up giving a small bhashan every time, I'll try and give some answer so that maximum number of people can speak up. But Ayush's question, of course, is very crucial that naming, categorizing, and in a way analyzing the ideology that sustains an oppressive system for a long time can also be a ticket to giving further life. In other words, it's putting more coal in the engine or fuel in the car to say, okay, let's continue for another 300 years. Now we have the formula. But there is one justification, which is that without naming, changing is very difficult. So you cannot do that and just say there is something, we must get away from it, and say to your colleagues or to anybody in the movement, I won't say it, but you and I know it. As we say in India, he's a wise gentleman, he understands. That is unfortunately won't work. We have to name and then, as it were, move on without reifying what you have done and making it so solid that it becomes immovable. So that is where we have people who are much greater minds than me, like Jacques Derrida, who will tell you you can also deconstruct. You can also name it, and then with the right hand deconstruct it a little bit. So it's not so sitting on your back like a huge 800-pound gorilla, which will then guarantee the life of the system. But it's an excellent question because it also means how do you name? How do you identify this phenomenology so that you don't make it a prison? So the great Frederick Jameson, one of the superheroes of Marxist literary criticism, he had a book called The Prison House of Language. That means when you use language, you can also make a cage. But I have never seen a way to escape the prison which is free of language. So we have to deal with that paradox creatively.
Okay, thank you so much, sir. I think Gautam sir and Divasri ma'am raised their hands. So if you can unmute yourselves, sir and ma'am, and
So
ask.
am I muted? No,
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 I'm
no, no,
okay.
no, 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 sir, no, sir.
Somebody
I
else.
just, I am asking just Divasri ma'am and Gautam sir. So please, ma'am. Sir.
Thank you so much, sir, for the wonderful lecture. It's my pleasure to listen to you because my PhD work is almost aligned with what you are saying presently.
One
So
question:
I am a,
is this Divyashi speaking?
yeah, yeah.
Right, because your picture is flashing. That's why I wondered whether it's you. But now I see it's you. Okay, please carry on. Sorry.
Actually, I am pursuing my PhD in sociology from Jadavpur University, Kolkata. And my work is
Oh,
precisely on the low caste people of West Bengal who are basically invested in crematorium, who are basically the corpse burner. So they are my primary respondents, and my work is also related on the philosophy of caste, embodiment of body, and the notion of purity and pollution that you are also mentioning. So thank you for taking Durkheim's understanding of conformity. That's very much pleasurable to listen because I'm a sociology student. Thank you for taking up Sarukai and Guru's understanding of caste, the philosophy of caste. I'm very much grateful to you for taking examples from sociology. So, Professor, precisely my question is on I have precisely two questions. One is the present notion of purity and pollution, which is happening in present India. Is it only empirical, or it's philosophical, or it's coming into existence on day to day practice? Like, is it hidden? Is it in the surface or in the depth? That is one of my question. And another is, like, while you were talking about the notion of the book Cracked Mirror by Guru and Sarukai, the endless debate on caste and the logic of philosophy of body, embodiment, and the notion of lower caste and upper caste, the notion of Brahmanical hierarchy and all. So whatever I have understood, that is precisely that there is always already everywhere a Brahmanical supremacy. So also I have understood one thing from that Guru and Sarukai's notion, that it's the inability of the Brahmin that they cannot touch the Shudra. So it's just not the conventional logic by which we see purity pollution, or the logic by which we understand Brahmins and Shudra as only caste structure or strata. So will you please focus some point on the opposite logic of understanding Brahmins' inability to touch the Shudra? I know I am
Yes.
not very much clear. I am
No,
very
no,
vague
no.
about what I am saying, but I'm very glad, very glad. Like I have read your articles when I have done my post graduation. I'm very glad that I'm listening to you at present times in a live meeting. Thank you so
Well,
much, sir.
thank
Thank you so
you.
much.
Thank you, Divyashri. Your university, Jadavpur, is well known to us,
Yeah.
both for its social science and for literature, cultural studies, etc. So I'm very happy to have you here. And of course, you're right that what you're working on is extremely close to what I'm thinking about, except that I'm not doing the detailed empirical work you are in a particular in a particular. Can you hear me?
Yes, sir.
Yes. Okay. Sorry. So, thank you for both questions, and in a way, I think they are connected. So, let me start with purity pollution, and I would say it is one of those things which is, if I may use a digital term, hardwired into our society. It is hardwired into our actions, our reactions, our automatic actions. So you think of people when they are eating in the street at a street vendor, how they wash their hands, how they do this, how they do that. Uh, there is a constant embodied hardwiring, but there is also some degree of reflective, conscious subscription to these views, whether it's done by people who are afraid of violating the social order or people at the other end, Brahmins who are proud of enforcing the social order. There may be some consciousness. Better not do this because this might happen, that might happen. But a lot of the time, when food is being handled, when marriage is being discussed, etc., no one will say that much. But it is always there in the actions, in the speech, in the bodily comportment, in all the signaling going on among 90% of the people. So I would say we don't we shouldn't feel that we have to choose. Is it on the surface or is it in the hardware? Is it permanent? Is it coming and going? Is it produced? Of course, I do believe that the daily interactions keep the whole system going. So that is one rather radical suggestion I'm making. It's not like there is an overall social plan, and then people are executing. The fact is they are recreating, reproducing, and actually co-constituting the system by their daily action. So I would avoid the dualism, which is somewhat part of your question. The second part is much more tricky because I do personally know and admire both Sundar Sarukai and Gopal Guru, and I know their continuing work, both joint and separate. And of course, they are slightly different from each other in their emphases. Gopal is much more, I think, than Sundar, interested in the political sociology of all this touch business. That is, who ends up in the government, who ends up in reserved jobs, what do they feel about that, the whole question of merit, etc. He's much more embedded in political economy and sociology of caste today. Sundar Sarukaya, on the other hand, is a philosopher. So he is really by nature inclined to the conceptual side of the argument. And there I have a feeling that he and I do see things fairly closely, namely that Brahmins have a certain driving need to distance themselves from the materiality of social life, from all the impurities, from sweat, from marriage, from this, from that. Unfortunately, they have to do it themselves. They have to clean. Then when the wife has a monthly period, the husband has to cook. So they're all fully enmeshed. But they would prefer not to be. Now, the difference between Sundar and me, in one simple way, is that Sundar tends to attribute this to a kind of philosophical set of issues in uh, Indic thought. I tend to see it as more the practical problem. How do I stay pure? That's it's a more engineering problem rather than a ontological, epistemological problem, which it is for Sundar. But that's because he's a philosopher. I'm an anthropologist, so there's no surprise. But I'm very much in that zone, and I think I don't have a better answer to your question, except again that the big challenge in India is how to combine the high level philosophy that everybody has. And in India, as you know, anybody, even the panwala, will tell you a philosophical theory if you ask him something about why he's making the pan this way. But there is also practical, experiential, sensorial logic going on, which no amount of philosophical passions will fully exhaust, whether they're coming from Brahmin or they're coming from anybody else. So I hope that's at least a partial answer to your excellent two questions.
Yes, sir. Thank you so much for responding to my questions and to clear my vague ideas about the topic. And I would be more grateful if you could name a few anthropological works on caste by you or by, the like scholars. It would be
So,
great for me.
my dear Divya, that is will become like the 108 names of Vishnu. You will have to go on and on. Many people in this audience know that the topic of caste has literally kept fill this room and five more rooms. But I also have an idea that a lot of that is milk and some of it is cream. So I can communicate perhaps with our organizers some bibliographic stuff later. But I can't quickly give you, shall we say, the creamy layer of the library or archive or past, not because I'm withholding it, not because it's IP, but I want to reflect a bit. I've given you some names. I think you have already shared them, Gopal. I've named Truman. There are others who are not so well known, but have done, to my mind, good work. And then there are the classics, which you can't get away from. Lee Duma cannot be avoided. Max Weber cannot be avoided. D.D. Goswami cannot be avoided. But I can't do it offhand, but I understand I'll try and do it by some other method to organize this. It's a little something which has helped me.
Okay, sir. Thank you so much.
You're welcome.
Thank you so much, sir. Gautam sir, you can unmute yourself and ask the question. Gautam sir, hello.
Some echoing is going on.
Sir, can I ask my question now? Am I audible, sir?
Yeah, now it's good. Who is this Gautam?
Yes, sir. So it's me, Gautam, here. So it was a wonderful experience to listen your whole lecture, and it brought new aspects of caste discrimination in the country to me, and it was a wonderful experience listening you, sir. And and of course, this is a profound historical question that sits at the intersection of textual study, archaeology, and sociology. And to justify the position that caste system, as we understood in today, was not a monolithic or fully rigid entity in ancient and medieval India, and requires a broad, multidimensional analysis of historical evidence. Though we, as in our historical or anthropological or archaeological study, we are studying various aspects of caste discrimination that prevailed and is still present in our society. But when we go to the roots of this caste system, we cannot ignore the literary text, what they say about the rigid caste system that was prevalent in the ancient and medieval era. And we, in our discussion, we are devoid of facts, we are devoid of historical evidences, literary sources, and a lot of things that need to be told before we come to any conclusion, right? So when we are talking about the rigid caste system, when we are talking about the caste discrimination and Brahmin superiority, we need to make some quote, citations. We need to tell the literary sources from where we are bringing these facts and figures in our discussion. So before coming to that, it is crucial to define what we mean by the caste system. Endogamy, hereditary occupation, and hierarchy and pollution that you were talking about, sir. A religious sanctioned graded hierarchy where upper groups are pure and lower groups are polluting, leading to practices like untouchability, Devdasi system, and all. And birth-based determinism. The membership in a group is determined solely by birth. So these are arguments that we have before we talk about. But what about the facts and figures? What about the literary sources that are the basis of historical and anthropological study about caste system, sir? Sir, if we look back, sir, then in Srimad Bhagavad Gita only, and not in the Upanishads, in Bhagavad Gita, in Vedic text, in Megasthenes book Indica, in other literary sources of ancient India, we get a different version of caste system. Am I audible, sir?
Yeah,
we
yeah.
we get different versions of caste system, but the interpretation matters a lot, that how we are interpreting from those literary sources. Suppose, sir, from a very famous Purush Sukt that was in the Rig Veda chapter 10, 90th shlok, that sole origin hymn for the four varnas that describes them as emanating from the body of cosmic Purush, right, sir? So the interpretation, this metaphor suggests an organic interdependent social body, not a rigid hierarchy. And I believe there are evidences from the early Buddhist texts, like Pali Canon. Buddhist texts are full of critics against the Brahminical claim of birth-based superiority, implying such claims were contested. But, sir, in the Vasal Sutta, the Sutta Nipata of chapter 1, 7th, it was written that not by the birth does one become an outcast, not by birth does one become a Brahmin, and by the deed, by the kamma, one becomes an outcast. And similarly, sir, in the Majjhima Nikaya and other Pitikas of Buddhist canons, we see that Brahmanism was and caste system was not rigid, but it was mobile. And from the evidences of foreign travelers, functional division, not ritual hierarchy, we have observed. Observations from foreign visitors provide an external lens, offer describing Indian society as divided by profession, not by an extreme ritual rigidity. For example, so Megasthenes, a Greek ambassador who came to Mauryan court, he only describes Indian society divided into seven genes, seven classes, philosophers, farmers, and all, and seven. So his account lacks any mention of endogamy, untouchability, or birth-based hereditary profession. His description aligns more with a fundamental division of labor, like Plato's Republic, isn't it? So this suggests that social reality, as he observed in the Mauryan Empire, was not rigid system of later centuries. Then, sir, we have some epigraphic and historical evidence of mobility as well. We have Nanda Empire before Mauryan. That empire was the ruler was from the Shudra origin. So the Greek historian Curitus record that the founder Mahanand was born of Shudra mother. Then Mauryan Empire in Divyadan Buddhist text refers to Chandragupta Maurya as from the low jati, Maurya. So the fact is the powerful empires could be established and ruled by those Brahminical texts labeled as Shudras. Proves that political power was not exclusive domain of Kshatris. Okay, sir. And evidence of intermarriages is also available in the Gupta Empire, often called Golden Age. In that, the Guptas frequently married to Lichavi clan, which Brahminical texts considered to be Kshatris, but other sources were of non-Kshatri origin. And Sir R.S. Sharma, in the scholar reference I'm giving, the Shudras in ancient India, provides extensive evidence of such mobility and intermingling, arguing that strictures of dharma suits, law books are often idealized norms rather than lived practice. And so there were Varkari tradition in Maharashtra, and in the North India we have Ravi Das. With the long they were low caste saints within the mainstream religion, which is a powerful evidence that theological justification for caste was never monolithic. Their lives and works speak of an alternative casteless spiritual reality that resonated with the millions. Then we have Sir Hyun Sang, his justification of the caste system, and there are a lot of I mean sir, even in the Taittiriya Upanishad, in Shukla Yajurved, sir, it is clearly mentioned that caste system was never rigid. Brahmins, by sir, we scholars are discussing about the Brahminical order. Do we even know what is the basic definition told by the Upanishads? Upanishads say Brahma Janati iti Brahmana, the one who makes endeavors to understand the cosmic world, the laws of universe, is a Brahmin. Brahmin is not someone who is practicing rigid caste system, who believes in the superiority of race. It is not like in the Western or European context we have studied so far. It is purely one who understands the cosmic laws. And in the Bhakti movement, sir, in the Tamil Nadu, Alvars and Niners were there. In Pulayan, there was a Dalit saint whose devotion transcends caste barriers, ultimately leading to his acceptance to at the Chidambaram temple. Why don't we mention this example in our work that caste system was not rigid? Brahmin is, if we're talking about the Brahminism, we should give some citations and evidences of the historical and literary sources for from where we are deriving these and our understanding about the Brahminical and rigid caste system. There was a Basavanna in Vaishnava Veer movement. He was a prime minister and spiritual leader who established the spiritual parliament. And this spiritual parliament was open to all castes and genders. Why don't we mention this about the Vachanas, the pithy poems in Kannada that are radical rejections of caste and ritual? Okay, sir. Akka Mahadevi in Dasmiya, where Veer Chef saints whose vachans vehemently oppose caste and gender discrimination. Then in Maharashtra, Varkari Panth, Chokha Mela, a Dalit, Mahar Dalit community member. You know? So there are a lot of things and literary sources, citations that we need to mention before we speak about historical context of caste discrimination, rigid caste system. And what we know about the Aetari Upanishads, sir, we as scholars are discussing about the rigid caste system. What we know about the Aetari Upanishad speaks about Brahminism. What Aetari Upanishad speaks about caste discrimination. So before we scholars continue our research, we speak about, we discuss, we need to make more efforts in understanding the basic Hindu
I
literature.
think I hear you,
Thank you,
Gautam.
sir.
Would you like to hear any response, or shall we just move on? Because you have filled in all the
But sir,
gaps.
just my question was, what are the literary sources that you can give as a citation in
I
proving?
get your question. I follow your question. And I was waiting for when you would have completed to see whether I can give some response. The first thing is that if I covered even 100th of what you said, this talk would become like a Ramayana performance in rural Orissa, meaning it would go on for 10 days. I don't think anybody wants that. Secondly, to say, actually, I agree with a lot of what you're saying. And there is a long history of distinguished Indologists from whom I have learned a lot. Starting with Kosambi, to Romila Thapar, to Shelley Pollock, and 200 others. So, like you, I rely on others, and Burton Stein, and uh, tons of people, Sanjay Subramanian, the list goes on. So, I'm not ignorant of this, but I would also say, Indian tradition is a little bit like Amartya Sen's book, Argumentative Indian. Everybody is arguing with everybody else, but certain things continue. Also, I never use the word rigid. I never said there is no mobility. These are all things I think you are preoccupied with. But rigidity is not my issue. For 40 years, I've been writing about movement in the system, rise of artisans, inscriptional record, which is not literary source, but something else in Tamil Nadu, etc. So, in fact, I sort of agree with everything you're saying, but one cannot, if I may give a stronger response, you cannot take the whole of Indian every resource from Rig Veda to Bhakti movement to Ravidas to this that and make a huge thali and just pick what you like and just assemble it and throw it in. It cannot be done. Point is, some things have more consensus over time. Even there are 1,000 views. In India, there are 1,000 views of everything. But do we have 1,000 systems of society? Do we have 1,000 ways that in which Dalits can live? Because Upanishads and something about Brahmins, does that change the situation of thousands of people oppressed? So I would just say, think about your strategy. I am all for bringing in all the sources, and we have hundreds of excellent analyses. But this talk, I would say, was not the moment for me to go into some 11th century inscription or the thought of some Sri Vaishnava figure from Srirangam in the 13th century. I can do that, not because I'm an expert. We can all do it. Today, I was trying to give some broader overview, and I don't think that our views are so far apart. We had a chance to discuss. I think we are talking at two different levels. There's some noise going on. I don't know why, but also I should say, Pallab, that my time is slowly going down, and so I need to know if somebody else has a short question. I can listen and respond.
Yeah,
Either
yeah.
you,
Yes,
Professor
sir.
Patel. Otherwise, we have some challenge. No? Although I am a great believer in what we call the ocean of wisdom or the ocean of milk, Kshir Sagar, which is around us. We must all drink in that ocean, but time is limited, life is short. What to do? I think,
Arunima
I'm not
Kalita.
sure.
Ma'am, Arunima Kalita, ma'am,
Yes,
you can
Aruna,
unmute
okay,
yourself.
please,
Ma'am.
please.
You can unmute yourself, ma'am.
Yes, Arunima is going to speak, or
Okay, sir. I am reading out this question. Okay. So she's asking that you recently mentioned that without endogamy there is no caste. It made me wonder, do you think there's any realistic possibility of endogamy reducing in the Indian context, given how structurally and emotionally entrenched caste still is across communities?
excellent, clear question. And I would be also, in a way, guessing or speculating, but we all have to speculate because without speculating and guessing, there is no imagining. Without imagining, there is no change. So we have to consider even possibilities that look remote or look unlikely. I think there is a growing sense among lots of people that the current situation is not acceptable. But it requires, in my view, for real change to happen in this area, which is personal, familial, affects livelihood, affects residence, where will you live, what will you do? It's a very basic thing beyond status and how will people see you, etc. So it's a very loaded issue, but I think the risk has to be collectivized. If you tell one family, one man and one woman, why don't you just take the risk? You'll be fine. You're living in Satara, go to Hyderabad, you will be fine. But that's a big risk for people to take on a small scale. So there has to be some larger scale. And I think people like Ambedkar and many others were trying to create a kind of large scale sense that you can do these things and you can move forward still and have the protection of the people who have moved with you. But that is the challenge of all radical social movements, including Western ones. You see, the great hopes that Marx had, working class would unite, this, that. Where are we today? That is because of all combined reasons, including the fact that escaping or exiting is a risky thing if you do it on small scale. But the challenge then becomes, how do you make it large scale? And many of our leaders did think about that. If you take Gandhi, for example, who was not a great radical in these areas, as we all know, but in other areas, he created a mass movement in a society where mass movement is very, very, very hard. So we know it's possible. But I wish I had some answer. And if I did, I would, of course, promptly run for MLA or MP somewhere. But as you can see, I'm far away and not going that way because I don't have an actionable answer, but I have high hope on principle. Thank you.
Okay, one question from Rakesh is asking, caste has long survived ruptures in political economy, from colonialism to neoliberal globalization. To what extent is the hegemonic sensorium historically contingent, and to what extent does it reveal a deeper ontological embeddings of caste in the Indian social imagination that resist temporal ruptures?
Yeah, very difficult and very important, very central question. Indeed, contingency is the fabric of history. The trouble is when contingency happens in the same way again and again. So it's like a roulette wheel coming always to number 31. The wheel is going around. It could go to 27, 34, 6, 5. But in India, it's coming to 30, 31, 32. Then from 32, go back to 31. As far as the fundamental constitution of social life is concerned, there are many other areas of changes. But when it comes to this matter, who will you marry, who will you touch, who will you eat with, who do you prefer to work with, the roulette wheel is constantly coming back. But contingency is always there. And our challenge is why is the what E.P. Thompson called the ruthlessness of contingency or context in history, nevertheless allowing this massive kind of persistence. That is, of course, the problem we're all trying to figure out, and I think is also implicit in your question. And I wish I had a straightforward answer, but I do think it has something to do. I'm still struggling with this, not just with marriage and endogamy, because that shifts the question. Because then we have to ask, why don't people change that endogamy rule? It's not a simple question to answer, but I would say it is something about everyday life rather than a central management like under Stalin or under Vatican, where somebody is giving you calls from the main headquarters or from RSS or BJP. You must not do that. There is no central. This is the best scholars of caste have noticed that it's what, to use somebody's phrase, a cellular system. You cut it in one place, it grows in another place. It is totally distributed, and there is no home ministry and no Amit Shah there. So, who is giving the orders? And it is not even the case that the local bosses or dadas or somebody is giving the instructions. It is literally as if it's in the water supply or it's in the brain wiring or something, meaning without central management, this system tends to reproduce. And that doesn't mean, to go to Gautam's question, that it's rigid, it changes. But as the French say, plus ça change. Everything changes and everything stays the same. So people move around, etc. But if we say, what is the order which it seems to be very persistent. And that mysterious capacity to reproduce at the local level leads me to say we have to look at the local level, not to find a key and say, among the Santals, we have found a key and we can explain the whole of India. Not like that. But to say we must look at daily interaction, see what produces the fear, what produces the obedience. Is it the fear of retribution, or some also survival? Like, I have to have all this in order to get to tomorrow. Is it a mixture of them? But I would say the answer is not in some big code at the top from central management. It is in the little reproductions which seem to be happening regardless of whether Buddhists are changing things, Christians are changing things, Constitution is changing things, Ambedkar is changing things. It can succeed in one part of Telangana, and next neighborhood is looking like as if it's 400 years ago. How to answer this? I wish I knew. But on that note, Palab, will you forgive me if we draw the matter, today's event, to a gentle conclusion, because my battery, is not ever ready, or Excello beginning to run low.
It is our distinct pleasure to have with us Professor Arjun Patnaik. Hello, sir.
Uh,
As you must say,
I'd like
we
to say
have,
one thing only.
yeah,
Where there is hegemony, there is resistance. Hegemony cannot exist by eliminating resistance. So where there is power, there is movement, there is counter power. Question is what Gautam Pandey was saying. If there is a Vishwamitra who had heterodox ashram, it doesn't mean that Vasistha was not orthodox. Doesn't mean that Manusmriti is not rigid. Point is, Gautam Pandey completely missed is that history of India is history of contest between Vasishtha and Vishwamitra, Buddha and Brahmins.
Correct.
Contest continues till now. He is referring to those liberal traditions which Vishwamitra and Valmiki and Phule and Bhakti movement represented. But he is not referring to the rigid traditions. There are rigid traditions which Manusmriti represented. And there are many heroes of rigid traditions, not just Manu. Therefore, this point is important for us to know that caste is a system of contradictions. Ramana Loya argues quite well. Caste must be seen as a system of contradictions between Vasishtha and Vishwamitra. It's a very powerful symbol, and as we from the left liberal traditions must discuss these contradictions. Without that, we will not be able to fair to analysis of caste. That's much I want to say in response to Mr. Pandey, who is a faculty member. Pandey Balab is a faculty member in the university.
He's
Pandey,
he has
Gautam
left
Pandey.
us.
He has left already. He asked the question and left. He is not there to listen.
It's what we call the eat and run. That is a guest who is eaten and run.
Yeah,
Yeah,
yeah.
I think he has left us, but I don't know who he is. So it would be interesting for you all to know. I think it was in the end a misplaced question,
Yeah,
but the specific examples are all, of course, relevant. We have to take them into account.
yeah,
And
yeah.
I can only say, Professor Patnaik, I actually totally agree with you that there is not uniformity here, but there are some big, major productive contradictions which then drive the engine. The engine is not just consent, and the engine is not pure resistance, which is barely contained. Both are going on the whole time, and the question is how the overall, what Gramsci would call hegemonic structure, into which people are, as Althusser said, interpolated, and then they begin to act. There is a lot to be said on that, but the hegemony somehow, I think, is clear and is resilient. But that doesn't mean it is not producing contradiction and resistance, which it then manages to co-opt. Then there's a new hegemony like that. So I'm very sympathetic to your point of view, and more could be said and should be said on that other score, for sure.
Thank you so much, sir. A few months ago, we had the pleasure of hosting you, Professor Patnaik, on this platform, Rabindranath Tagore and Spiritual Democracy. And it was truly an enriching experience listening to your valuable insights. We're delighted to have you back with us today. Thank you so
Well,
much.
thank you, and thank everybody else who came. Thanks to Professor Patnaik
And
also.
Thank you, thank you, thank you.
so,
It was a pleasure to
before we
listen to
bring
you.
Sorry, I interrupted you. Pallab was still
no, no,
talking.
no,
I
no,
thought,
no, no, sir. No, sir. No, sir. It's absolutely fine. Okay, so can I start?
yes. So I'll say goodbye and hope to
Okay.
stay in touch.
Okay, so before we bring today's gathering to a close, I wish to extend on behalf of Voices from the Periphery and everyone present here, and also most heartfelt gratitude to you, Professor Appadurai. Your lecture on the hegemonic sensorium and the persistent caste has been nothing short of transformative. You have led us into the subtle, often invisible terrains where power takes root, not only in the institutions and structures, but in our senses, our perceptions, and the very textures of daily life. You have revealed to us how caste persists not simply as a social arrangement, but as an embodied experience inscribed in what we see, what we hear, what we touch, and what we are conditioned to ignore. What you offered us today was not just a theoretical framework, but a way of refilling the world. You showed us that domination lives in our sensorium, but also that resistance and imagination can emerge from these very spaces. Your hands caste become not only an object of study, but a lens through which we must confront how deeply inequality seeps into the ways we sense, interpret, and inhabit our realities. Your words remind us that scholarship at its highest calling is not confined to analysis alone. It awakens our imagination, sharpens our senses, and reorients us toward justice for us, students, teachers, and seekers alike. Today's lecture has been a profound gift, calling us to examine not only what we know, but how we come to know, and to ask how we might unlearn, resense, and reimagine a world beyond entrenched hierarchies. We leave this gathering not only enlightened but also burdened with a responsibility to listen more carefully, to see more critically, and to act with greater courage in the face of the subtle and enduring violences of caste. Your presence among us has reminded us that knowledge itself can be an act of resistance, and that to unsettle the dominant sensorium is to open the door to futures that are more just, more human, and more free. From the depths of our hearts, we thank you, Professor Appadurai, for your generosity, your vision, and the moral force of your scholarship. Though this session now comes to a close, the resonance of your words will remain with us, shaping our scholarship, our classrooms, and our imaginations for years to come. With reverence and humility, I bring this gathering to a close, carrying forward the inspiration and responsibility that your lecture has placed upon us. Thank you so much, sir, for joining us today.
Many, many thanks. I will say my goodbyes and express my appreciation and hope that our paths collectively or individually directly will cross in the future. Thank you.
Thank you. Bye.
Thank you, sir. Thank you, Varun, sir. Thank you.
Thank you. Bye bye.
Bye, sir.